Keanu Reeves broke down in tears on Jimmy Fallon's show after revealing a deeply personal story that he had never shared publicly before. The emotional confession stunned the audience and completely changed how people saw the quiet, humble actor behind the Hollywood legend. Keanu sat under the blinding studio lights, laughing with Jimmy like any other late-night guest, but his eyes kept drifting toward the edge of the stage, as if he were listening to a memory only he could hear. The audience saw the movie star in a black suit. They didn't see the man whose entire life had been quietly leading to this one unexpected breaking point on live television. He had arrived at the studio hours earlier, moving with that gentle, almost shy politeness that confused people who expected a loud Hollywood ego. He thanked every crew member, shook every hand, and kept his head slightly bowed, as if fame were something heavy he carried instead of something he wore. In his dressing room, a framed photo lay on the table, one he hadn't asked for, one that the show's researchers had placed there for nostalgia. It showed a much younger Keanu, standing on a grimy city street, laughing with two friends who weren't alive anymore. He stared at it for a long time, thumb resting on the edge of the glass, the noise of the studio muffled behind the door. When a stage manager knocked and cheerfully told him, "5 minutes, Mr. Reeves," he slipped the photo into his jacket pocket without a word. He knew the routine: walk out, wave, sit, tell a funny story about a stunt gone wrong, maybe share a harmless anecdote about a fan encounter. Tonight was supposed to be about his new action movie, another carefully choreographed storm of gunfire and flying fists. But beneath the calm surface, something inside him felt different, like a door he had kept bolted for years had finally begun to crack open. As the band played him onto the stage, the crowd exploded with applause. He smiled that small, grateful smile, pointed shyly at a few fans in the front row, and sat down opposite Jimmy, who leaned across the desk, grinning. They traded jokes, easy and light, the kind of banter that keeps ratings high and hearts unbothered. Keanu talked about stunt training, about how many times he'd fallen downstairs for a single shot, about the bruises he'd worn home like hidden trophies. The audience roared with laughter. On the surface, it was working. Everything was safe. Everything was normal. But Jimmy had done his homework. Producers had whispered that if they wanted a truly unforgettable moment, they had to nudge the conversation toward the one thing Keanu almost never talked about: his past, the quiet tragedies, the weight behind that gentle smile. So after a perfectly timed joke landed and the laughter began to die down, Jimmy's tone softened. He reached under the desk, pulled out the very same old photograph that was now burning a hole in Keanu's jacket pocket, and held it up to the camera. "We found this," he said, voice warm but curious. "This is you before all of this, before the movies, before the fame. Tell me about that night." For a heartbeat, the studio felt silent, even though the band was still playing faintly and someone in the back coughed. Keanu's gaze locked on the photo. The image of his younger self, the two friends beside him, the cracked sidewalk, the flickering neon sign of a forgotten diner, all of it slammed into him at once. The audience leaned forward, expecting another charming story about youth and struggle and eventual success. But Keanu's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair, knuckles whitening, as if he were holding onto the edge of a rooftop and the drop beneath him was suddenly, terrifyingly real. He hesitated, his lips parting, 1,000 memories rushing in, gunshots in the dark, a stolen car, a promise made in the rain, a love he never expected to find, and a single night that had changed everything he believed about kindness and courage. For the first time all evening, he didn't know which version of the truth he was supposed to give: the neat Hollywood story, or the real one that still hurt to touch. His throat tightened, and when he finally looked up, There was a strange shine in his eyes that made Jimmy's smile falter for just a second. On national television, with millions watching, Keanu breathed in slowly, as if steadying himself on a ledge only he could see. His voice dropped, softer, rougher. "That night," he began, the words trembling around the edges, "was the first time I understood how one act of kindness can turn a life from darkness to something else entirely." The audience went quiet, sensing the shift, sensing that the usual jokes and rehearsed anecdotes were gone. In their place stood something raw, something dangerous, something truer than anything they'd expected to hear from a man known for playing invincible heroes. He paused again, lost for a moment in the memory of a rain-soaked alley, flashing police lights, and a desperate choice that had almost destroyed him before his career had even begun. His hand rose unconsciously toward his chest, where the old photo rested like a heartbeat he couldn't ignore. And as the camera slowly pushed in on his face, capturing the first glimmer of tears at the corner of his eyes, the world leaned closer, waiting to hear what really happened on the night that had shaped the man everyone thought they already knew. The night in the alley. Rain hammered the city that night like it was trying to wash the streets clean of everything broken and forgotten. Years before the talk shows, before the red carpets, Keanu was just another struggling actor sprinting across downtown with a cheap leather jacket, a half-finished script in his bag, and the taste of rejection still sharp in his mouth. His audition had gone badly. The casting director had smiled politely, thanked him, and then glanced at her watch in that quiet way that told him he was already gone from her mind. He didn't have money for a cab, so he cut through back streets, past shuttered shops and humming neon signs, his boots splashing through puddles. He was thinking about calling it quits, about going back home, about every person who had told him he wasn't good enough, not trained enough, not the right type. He was so lost in his own doubts that at first he didn't notice the sound coming from the alley ahead. A shout, sharp and panicked, followed by a crash of metal and the dull echo of fists against flesh. He slowed, heart thudding. Part of him wanted to walk past, to pretend he hadn't heard anything. In that neighborhood, people minded their own business if they wanted to stay intact. But then he heard it, a voice, hoarse and desperate, crying, "Please stop, I don't have anything else." It was followed by another grunt, the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. Keanu's chest tightened. He edged toward the mouth of the alley, eyes adjusting to the darkness. 3 men stood over a 4th figure curled on the wet concrete, kicking and swearing, one of them waving a gun around like a toy. Keanu swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at him to back away slowly, to run, to survive. He had nothing, no money, no big future, nothing but a thin jacket and a dream that was already slipping through his fingers. What difference would it make if he got himself killed for a stranger? But then the figure on the ground rolled slightly, and the weak glow of a street lamp caught his face. Keanu recognized him instantly. It was Tomas, the old diner cook who had once fed Keanu for free when he couldn't afford a meal, the man who always slipped him extra fries and whispered, "You're gonna make it, kid. I can feel it." That memory hit him the way the rain hit the asphalt, fast, relentless, undeniable. This wasn't just some stranger. This was the one person in this bleak neighborhood who had treated him with kindness when he was invisible to everyone else. Unexpected heat flared in his chest, a mixture of fear and anger and something else, responsibility. He could walk away and live with the knowledge that the only man who had believed in him had been left bleeding in an alley. Or he could do something reckless, something brave, something that might cost him everything. The man with the gun barked a threat and kicked Tomas in the ribs again. Keanu's hands clenched. Without fully understanding why, without any real plan, he stepped forward out of the shadows and said, voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the storm, "Hey, leave him alone." The 3 attackers froze and turned toward him, their faces hard, their eyes cold. One of them laughed. The one with the gun tilted his head, amused, as if some stray dog had just decided to bark at a pack of wolves. Keanu could feel his heart slamming against his ribs so hard it almost hurt. He was outnumbered, unarmed, and stupidly standing in the worst possible place. But he also felt something else, an odd, surprising clarity like the moment before a stunt when he knew he had to commit fully or not jump at all. The gunman took a step toward him, raising the weapon to chest level, finger resting casually on the trigger. "You got a death wish, kid," he sneered. The rain poured harder, drumming against metal dumpsters, turning the ground slick and treacherous. Keanu's mind raced. Every second stretched like an eternity. He could still turn and run. He could still apologize, pretend it was a mistake, disappear back into the anonymity of the city. But Tomas's groan from the ground cut through his thoughts, low and broken. That sound made the choice for him. Keanu inhaled slowly, locking eyes with the man holding the gun, and said, with a voice far steadier than he felt, "You want something. Take it from me instead." For a heartbeat, the alley went perfectly still. Then the gunman's smile died, replaced by something darker. He lifted the weapon higher, finger tightening, and Keanu's world narrowed to the black circle of the barrel and the thunder of his own pulse. Somewhere behind him, a siren wailed faintly in the distance, drawing closer. A deal with the darkness. The gunshot never came. Instead, a siren screamed closer, slicing through the rain and rattling the rusted fire escapes above them. Somewhere at the mouth of the alley, red and blue lights flickered, painting the wet brick walls with frantic color. The gunman cursed, glancing over his shoulder. For a brief second, his attention shifted away from Keanu, and in that fragile sliver of time, something inside Keanu snapped free from fear. He lunged forward, not with the grace of a trained fighter, but with the clumsy desperation of someone who has decided that doing nothing is no longer an option. His shoulder slammed into the gunman's chest, sending them both crashing to the ground. The weapon skidded across the slick concrete, clattering against a dumpster. The other two attackers shouted and rushed at him. Fists and boots and cold water exploded around him in a blur. Pain lit up his ribs and jaw. He tasted blood and metal. His vision flashed white as a kick caught the side of his head. He wasn't winning, he knew that. But he also knew he had bought Tomas a few seconds that might mean the difference between life and death if the police followed the lights into the alley. He forced himself back up, staggering, raising his arms in a sloppy guard. One of the men swung at him. Keanu ducked instinctively, years of stage combat training suddenly translating into something real. He countered with a wild punch that landed more by luck than skill, cracking against a cheekbone. The man stumbled, swore, and drove a knee into Keanu's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. Keanu collapsed to one knee, gasping, ribs screaming. A boot drew back to smash into his face, but suddenly froze. "Cops!" someone shouted. At the far end of the alley, two officers appeared, guns drawn, shouting commands. The attackers bolted in three directions like scattered shadows. One vaulted a fence. Another vanished between buildings. The gunman, panting and bleeding from a cut above his eye, glared down at Keanu for a long, hateful second, then spat on the ground beside him and sprinted into the darkness. The police sprinted past Keanu, chasing the fleeing silhouettes. One officer paused just long enough to shout, "Stay down, don't move," before racing after the others. The siren wailed away, echoing through the maze of streets. In the sudden, ragged quiet, Keanu dragged himself over to Tomas, whose hands were trembling as he tried to push himself upright. "Hey," Keanu rasped, wincing as his ribs protested. "Hey, it's okay, they're gone." Tomas blinked through the rain, dazed and bloodied. When he recognized Keanu, his cracked lips twitched into a weak, disbelieving smile. "You idiot," he wheezed. "You should have run." Keanu laughed unsteadily, the sound half-choked, half-relieved. "Yeah, well, you still owe me a burger." It was a terrible joke, but Tomas's eyes softened, wet from more than just the rain. In that moment, everything else, his failed audition, his empty wallet, the pain throbbing in his jaw, fell away. What remained was a simple truth. He had chosen to stand between violence and someone who had once chosen kindness. Before they could say anything else, the sound of hurried footsteps pounded back toward them. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, landing directly on Keanu as he knelt beside Tomas, one hand braced protectively on the older man's shoulder. "Hands up!" a voice barked. Startled, Keanu froze, confusion jolting through him. He raised his hands slowly, blinking against the light. Another officer approached, weapon drawn, eyes hard and suspicious. "Officer, Tomas started, but a cough racked his body, cutting his words short. The first cop grabbed Keanu's wrist, yanking him to his feet. "We got a call about an armed robbery and assault," the officer snapped. "You match the description, dark jacket, medium build, leaving the scene." "What, no, Keanu protested, but the words tangled with exhaustion and shock. His face hurt. His ribs burned. He could barely think. The officer spun him around, cold metal pressing against his wrists as handcuffs clicked shut. Rain ran down his face, mixing with the faint, metallic taste of blood. "You've got it wrong," Keanu said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I was helping him." Another flashlight swept over the ground, landing on the gun resting near the dumpster. "Weapon located," the second officer called out. He glanced between the gun and Keanu, lines of suspicion carving deeper into his expression. "Looks like our good Samaritan was busy tonight." Keanu's stomach dropped. This was backwards, completely, impossibly backwards. He opened his mouth to argue again, but the first officer tightened his grip on Keanu's arm, steering him toward the street. "You can explain downtown," he said curtly. "Right now, you're under arrest." The cruiser's back door yawned open like a small steel cell, waiting. Tomas struggled to sit up, voice hoarse. "He saved me," he called after them, fighting to be heard over the rain. "He's not." The officer nearest him gently pushed him back down. "Sir, you need medical attention," he said. "We'll sort out who did what later." As Keanu was guided into the back of the police car, the reality of it slammed into him. One reckless act of courage, one choice to step out of the shadows, and now he was the one in cuffs. His heart pounded with a new kind of fear, not of bullets this time, but of something slower, colder. A system that might not care who he really was or what he'd really done. As the door slammed shut and the engine growled to life, he stared through the rain-streaked window at Tomas lying on the pavement, paramedics hurrying toward him, wondering if this was the moment his entire life took a darker turn he'd never escape. The cruiser pulled away, its siren off but its lights still flashing silently, dragging Keanu into an uncertain future where courage looked dangerously like guilt. The choice that changed everything. The holding cell was small, fluorescent, and smelled faintly of bleach and old fear. Keanu sat on a hard metal bench, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together so tightly they ached. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving behind an ache that lived deep in his bones and a spreading bruise along his ribs that flared every time he breathed too deeply. Across from him, a cracked mirror reflected a version of himself he barely recognized. Hair plastered to his forehead, shirt torn, a smear of dried blood along his jawline. Hours blurred. Questions came in waves. Where were you before the incident? Did you know the victim? Why did you run toward the scene? Delivered by a tired detective who looked like he'd heard every lie in the book. Keanu told the truth every time as plainly as he could. He explained the audition, the shortcut, the memory of Tomas pressing a warm plate of food into his hands when he'd been broke and humiliated. He explained the fear, the gun, the rush to protect someone who had once protected him in a quieter way. The detective listened, arms crossed, expression hard to read. When Keanu finished, there was a long silence. Finally, the man sighed and said, "You know what your problem is, kid? Your story sounds too good, too noble. Guys who get into fights in alleys don't usually talk about kindness and gratitude." Keanu almost laughed at the bitter irony. "I'm an actor," he said weakly. "Maybe that's why it sounds like a monologue." The detective's mouth twitched just a little, like he wanted to smile but had forgotten how. He closed his notebook. "We're waiting on the victim's statement," he said. "If your story checks out, you'll walk. If it does—" His voice trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Keanu understood. He would be the man with the gun in their minds, not the one who'd knocked it away. Back in the cell, Keanu leaned his head against the wall, eyes closing. Doubt crept in like a slow leak. Maybe he should have kept walking. Maybe the world didn't reward people who stepped between violence and its victims. Maybe all his life he'd misunderstood what courage actually cost. Humiliation settled in his gut like a stone. How could he call his mother and tell her where he was? How could he ever face Tomas again if the man's injuries or memory blurred the truth? Then, somewhere in the depths of the station, a phone rang. Muffled voices rose and fell outside. Footsteps approached. The cell door clanged open, and the detective appeared, a different look on his face this time, less stone, more human. "Get up," he said. "You're leaving." Confusion flashed through Keanu. "What did Tomas wake up?" The detective nodded once. "He woke up, and he won't stop talking about you." They walked down a corridor together, past corkboards cluttered with notices and faces. As they moved, the detective spoke more quietly. "He said you saved his life, said you jumped in front of a gun like you didn't care if you made it out, said if we charged you he'd camp out on the courthouse steps until someone listened." A strange mixture of relief and embarrassment washed over Keanu. "I didn't jump in front of a gun," he muttered. "I just moved before I could think better of it." The detective glanced sideways at him. "Most people think better of it," he said, "and they walk away." They reached the front desk. A clerk slid a clear plastic bag toward Keanu containing his few belongings, his wallet, his watch, the script he'd been carrying, now rumpled and damp. At the bottom of the bag lay the old photograph, edges warped from the rain. He picked it up carefully, almost reverently, and for a moment his throat tightened. The detective cleared his throat. "No charges," he said. "The real gunman was picked up 2 blocks away. Your story lines up with what witnesses saw. You're free to go." Keanu nodded, unsure how to express the swirl of gratitude and lingering anger inside him. "Thank you," he said simply. The detective studied him, then added, "For what it's worth, my brother used to talk about doing something like you did, getting involved, making a difference. He never got the chance. So when you ask yourself later if it was worth it, just remember some of us out here are glad people like you still exist." Outside, the sky had cleared. The streets were slick but quiet, city lights reflecting off puddles like broken stars. Keanu stepped out into the cool night air and inhaled deeply, feeling both lighter and older than he had that morning. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his agent barking about missed calls, about producers waiting for answers. He ignored it for a moment and instead walked to the edge of the sidewalk, staring at his reflection in a shallow pool of water. He thought about the choice he'd made and the strange, painful path it had carved through his day. He thought of Tomas, lying in a hospital bed, bruised but alive. He thought of the detective's grudging respect. And under all of that, he felt a quiet, stubborn conviction beginning to harden, that a life measured only in roles, paychecks, and applause would never be enough for him. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed again, more insistent this time. With a resigned sigh, he answered. His agent's voice exploded through the speaker, half panicked, half electrified. "Keanu, where the hell have you been? The casting director from this morning called. They heard about what happened. They want to see you again, and not for a small role." Keanu froze on the sidewalk, heartbeat stuttering. "How?" he managed. "Do they even know about tonight?" There was a pause, followed by his agent's disbelieving laugh. Kid, your little stunt already hit the local news. Unknown actor saves neighborhood cook from armed attackers. They're calling you the real-life action hero. The director said anyone crazy enough to do that might be exactly the kind of authenticity he wants on screen. The city hummed quietly around him, unaware that in this single, improbable moment, two roads were crossing, who he had been and who he might become. Standing there under the fading glow of streetlights, battered and bone-tired, Keanu realized that the night which could have ruined his life had instead handed him something terrifying and rare. A chance. A chance not just to act like a hero in front of cameras, but to decide what kind of man he would really be when the cameras weren't looking. And as he whispered a hoarse, almost disbelieving, "Okay, I'll go back," he had no idea that years later, that same night, this forgotten alley, that impossible choice, would be the story that finally broke him open on national television, with the entire world listening for what he would say next.